And I just wanted to open up uh, with a couple updates from Chairman Miller. As you know, I meet with him usually on a weekly basis, and actually Dr. Dempsey has been joining us as well, as he's being onboarded for his new role as Chairman Miller is leaving. And he just wanted me to remind everyone to just kind of emphasize the importance of the July meetings to wrap things up. And I just wanted to bring forth this estimated timeline to just remind everyone of what the timeline is. I know you're all aware from the past couple meetings, but just to emphasize the importance of wrapping things up for the July meeting. And then I also wanted to bring up the possibility of having an August co-chairs meeting. So I wanted to know your thoughts on that to kind of wrap things up co-chair wise after the subcommittee meetings, for any final thoughts or collaboration that needs to be done by the co-chairs. And I was going to send out a doodle poll, but if anybody has any strong feelings for or against that, please let me know now.
I think that meeting would be a really good idea, Kim.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and better to have it on the calendar and not need it than the reverse.
Okay, I will send out a doodle poll today after this meeting. And then I know there's been some cross-pollination between subcommittees as far as recommendations, and I didn't know if there needed to be any joint subcommittee meetings. It can be a little difficult to put together, but it is something that we could possibly do, or we could even poll two subcommittees if it affects different subcommittees as far as getting feedback from a different subcommittee. But I am providing recommendations from different subcommittees to the subcommittee that is providing that decision. And I know that that's been happening often across subcommittees. So I just wanted to open the floor if anybody thinks that a joint subcommittee meeting needs to happen for, say, two subcommittees. I would encourage not to have more than two at a time. But if so, then I need to make sure that gets scheduled as soon as possible.
Kim, this is Maureen. I think it'd be really helpful for advancement and development to have a joint meeting with licensure because we have so much overlap with them. And then maybe just to send like some of our ideas in advance to prep and entry, just to make sure we're kind of on the right track for what we're suggesting for the level 1, 2, and 3.
Sure. And one thing to piggyback off that, Maureen, as far as letting corresponding subcommittees know about recommendations from your own subcommittee, feel free to email each other and just let each other know what's going on in each other's subcommittees, because you don't have to wait for me to provide that recommendation. You can CC me on it so I know that they're aware of what you've sent for future discussions in their planning sessions. But Maureen, please feel free to go ahead and send that to Van and Hank.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You don't have to wait around for me on that.
Okay.
In
Thanks,
fact,
Kim.
you'll probably explain it better than I will.
Well, I don't know about that, but.
Any other thoughts on sharing information with other subcommittees, such as recommendations, or having any other kind of joint subcommittee meetings across subcommittees? Okay.
Kim, I don't have a strong feeling about our subcommittee meeting with any of the others. And I'd be interested in Hank's view on that as well. Most of my, the things that have come up to me I think can be discussed in this kind of venue, and then we take it back to the subcommittees. But Hank, totally open if we need to have a full subcommittee meet with another full subcommittee.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I feel like we've sent the things across to the committees who needed that information, but otherwise, I feel like we're okay right now.
Okay, great. And I know that Dr. Graham joined a little bit late, so I just wanted to reiterate for his benefit that Chairman Miller focused and honed in on the July meeting, and just to wrap things up with your subcommittee for the July meeting. And then I don't know if you heard, I'm going to send out a doodle poll for the August co-chair joint meeting. And I just asked for any strong opinions on that. And it sounded like folks wanted that. If you have a different opinion, just let me know.
No, I'm good with that. Thanks for the summary, Kim.
Sure. And then if you need to send any recommendations to another subcommittee, of course, I have a few from your last meeting, but if you want to send anything directly to another set of co-chairs, please feel free to do that through email and just CC me, just so I have a record of what's being sent back and forth so I don't repeat history. But I would be happy to do that, or please feel free to communicate yourself across email as well. And then I just wanted to provide an opportunity for any type of open discussion that you feel like you need to share with other co-chairs. So it's pretty open for the rest of the meeting.
Hey, Kim, I'll offer one to get started. When you and I were trading emails earlier, the couple of themes that had come up in preparation and entry that I'd be curious to know if and how other subcommittees are talking about this. One was the foundational importance of the NTAS standards in North Carolina. Of course, we talk about that a lot in educator preparation. But number one, the standards themselves, and then the progression work that NTASC has done, and how that cuts across all the licensure areas, and the importance of performance assessment as a component that we would use. So to what degree NTASC and the progression, NTASC progression is in your discussions, and then performance assessment? Can I ask that question, Kim?
Sure.
Dr. Dempsey, are you asking that of us, or are you saying that's the type of question you want to ask someone?
Both. It is. Yeah. For the people on the call, has that come up in your subcommittee? Either of those come up in your subcommittees?
I do know for advancement and development that the competencies and skills, they have looked at NTASC to help shape some of those. I don't know if Maureen wants to add anything else to that.
Yeah, Kim, I was just getting ready to unmute as you said that. Yeah, so that's kind of what we use to drive like our initial conversation, and then continuously kind of looking back at those to make sure we're on track. But we did use those as we were developing the competencies for advancement and development's work.
Van and budget and compensation, I can't recall a specific instance where a conversation has emerged around NTAS standards. I could be wrong, Aaron. You can correct me if I am, but I don't recall that ever emerging in a discussion.
Yeah, not within our group.
Thanks.
I would like to hear from the other co-chairs as it relates to budget and compensation. Obviously, our topic is a lightning rod topic, and we're getting input from our K-12 classroom teachers from across the state and so forth. But any information, any guidance, any suggestions or recommendations that may be emerging, whether it's from your subcommittee proper or just from what you're hearing from the field or from ed prep. Just would be interested what types of things you've heard and what you might suggest as guidance or recommendation for Dr. Fleming and I, or Dr. Fleming and me.
So, Dr. Graham, this is Maureen, and not that this has really come up so much in our subcommittee discussions, but just in other discussions and feedback that I've gotten from teachers and from other people in the field. If there's a way to consider, so like right now, if you're a licensed 4 teacher and you do not successfully renew your license, you would not get the $5,000 bonus. So the question was, let's say I had 3 years where I wasn't effective, and then I had my next 2 years I was effective. So now I didn't achieve that 3 years of effectiveness within 5 years, but then the next year I'm effective again. Well, now I've had 3 consecutive years of effectiveness. Do I then need to wait 4 more years in order to get that $5,000 a year raise, or would it be possible for me to start getting that raise once I meet that effectiveness goal? So that was one thing that came up. And then another thing that's come up is, how do we account for teachers who have substantial time already in the classroom? So like, for instance, like if I've been teaching for 15 or 20 years, would there be a way, as this model is rolled out, to acknowledge that? And either I start off at a higher pay, or there's some kind of formula, like with using the longevity scale or something, to acknowledge teachers that have had significantly more time in the classroom. Is there a way that we'd be able to do that? So just 2 things that I've kind of heard come up, and I think your subcommittees discussed some of those, but I just wanted to highlight those here.
No, thanks, Maureen. I appreciate that. You're right. We've talked about some type of hybrid model or something of that nature. So we're still kind of kicking around ideas, if you will, but I appreciate that input.
Yeah, and I was gonna say that's something we can bring up. Now, my understanding is you would, Tom, correct me, from the way the committee or Dr. Grant, from the way we stand right now, it is every renewal period, even though you're, let's say, well, of course, we don't have all the standards figured out with effectiveness and all that, what the measures would be, I guess, but it is every 5 years. So I don't think you would have to wait another 5 years. Is that correct? So if you didn't make the mark this year, when you go to renew, that's your only opportunity, will be when you renew as of today. Is that correct?
That's the way I understand it, Dr.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
Because
And not to say that can't change. I'm not saying that's the end all be all, but I know as of right now, if you miss it this year, and you're out until you renew again.
And just to clarify, that was my understanding as well,
Yeah.
but just bringing up the conversation
Yes,
I've had with other people.
I agree. That's I think it's again something else. And then kind of on the, I know we've talked about the grandfathering in and the hold harmless, but we may need to look at that kind of hybrid, as I think Dr. Graham said, just a way to potentially meet somebody in the middle that we know could be a good teacher leader, but doesn't want to wait the 5 years or how many ever years they have to go until they renew again. And again, we can discuss that in the committee, but if we did anything, I don't know if we would just divide it by 5 and they could potentially have, if you have 2 years left, then you get, 2/5 of whatever, or
well, I think this is a great question, but I think this is a great question for Alexis, because I don't fully understand sometimes the implications of these kinds of things in terms of budget, but you'd have to kind of model this for the General Assembly to understand how many teachers would not meet this. What is the expectation of how many teachers would not meet that and therefore not have the $5,000 raise? And then you budget based on that. And so to have within a biennium budget, if you've got shifts in that, that's going to create some problems for you. So I mean, we'd have to think about that in terms of what I know right now. We looked at this across years, and about 15% of teachers have EVOS, for just using EVOS, did not meet that standard of 3 out of 5 years being meeting expected growth or better. So you'd have to get to, you know, for the purposes of budgeting this, you'd have to get to some determination of where the lines are, or then it's just going to be a budget free for all. And I don't think that that's tenable. Does that make sense? I think I've killed the conversation.
No, it makes perfect sense.
I agree. There's a lot of variables.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you couldn't work it into every biennium budget. Like,
Right.
you know, I mean, having a different kind of model. And I want to be clear with that 15%. That's just looking at one pathway. The idea is there would be multiple pathways, and teachers are not going to be blind going into this, what the best path for them might be. So like if you're, if you're getting early indications that you're not meeting expected growth, then, teachers could potentially avail themselves of a different pathway to try to meet that expectation. So I don't want that 15% getting out as that's how many teachers will not get a renewal bonus. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if we just look at this at EVOS, the number is relatively small compared to the teachers who do meet that standard.
And then Tom, the other, sorry, Dr.
No, go
Graham.
ahead, Martin. No, go ahead.
I was just say the other really important thing there too is right now, those 15% of teachers, we don't have a good way to support them in their teaching practice. So we don't have a person who can be in their classroom and help them and go through data with them and help them identify new strategies and methods to reach the diverse needs of all the kids in their classroom. But under this new model, that person will be in your school and be available to be there and help that teacher in their effectiveness. And so that I think is another huge value of this model, is that we're finding ways to make teachers more effective and providing the supports that are necessary for teachers to become more effective. And that's, I think, that will change, I think, the narrative of the number of teachers that we're seeing that are ineffective, because now we'll have ways to help them become more effective as they're teaching, not necessarily just waiting, until they get to the 5-year point and realizing they didn't meet growth.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this group has to recognize that if EVOS can't be the only path to this, because it is a relative measure. There will always be losers. I use that term in quotes, in terms of their effectiveness, even if everybody was advancing kids 2 years in a year's worth of instruction, but their achievement was comparable to 2 years worth of instruction. Even that, in that instance, there would be some people who would be red in this model. So I want to be very clear that even for those teachers that use EVOS, you're going to need, they could be effective, but the measure is showing them not meeting expectations of the state average. It is part of the whole model. I mean, those red folks will have to be there. They will always be there. And so we have to have a different method for those teachers to demonstrate, even though they're not in alignment with the state average in terms of their growth, they are exhibiting those practices and that we find to be associated with effective teachers. So I'm just arguing again that we have to have multiple routes for this renewal piece, or we're going to be, or are we going to be condemning a certain percentage of our teachers to not getting a bonus, regardless of how well they're doing with their students?
And I think another really important thing to add on to that, Tom, is that this model gives teachers the choice in how they're going to say they were effective. You're not like right now, the only option we have to say whether or not we're effective practitioners is EVOS, if you're an EVOS teacher. And now you'll have multiple different ways. So if your EVOS scores come back and say, yes, you were effective with your students, that's great. You have the option to use that. But if you are one of those teachers, like you were saying, that even though you're doing amazing things with your students, the EVOS scores still come back and have you not meeting growth, you would have other options. And it would be your choice as the teacher to determine which one of those options tells the best story of you as the practitioner and the kids in your classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. That is absolutely right. And I feel like that message somehow is not resonating out there, that we're still getting pegged that this is all about EVOS.
Absolutely. That message is completely overlooked and missed in
Yeah.
every conversation that anyone has with me. It's all EVOS.
Yeah.
So obviously there'll be an effort to ensure there's a communication strategy around what happens in this area. But right now, that message is not resonating with folks for whatever reason. Well, I appreciate you all indulging me there.
So Dr. Graham and Dr. Fleming, is that a conversation, or is it something you'd like me to speak to in the budget and compensation?
If you don't mind speak, yeah, it'd
Yeah,
be good
I
to
agree.
speak to that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I can show, and I can be very honest and transparent about this, that EVOS cannot drive this car. I mean, there's no way. And I think me saying something like that will take people by surprise. I think they think I think that EVOS is the Bible or something.
No comment on that, Tom.
Tom, sort of to that point about the communication of things, and maybe Kim, this is a question for you, are the subcommittees beginning to format language the same way? I mean, can we start to get a sense of what this document's going to look like when we get to August?
I think across subcommittees, they're starting to collaborate within the subcommittees to bring together decisions. There are some of the same thoughts across subcommittees as far as possible recommendations. And I've noticed that, but what do you mean the language itself?
Well, as the project has been framed so far, we've used that PowerPoint that we saw at PEPSC and then went to the state board as the way to frame the information. Do we envision something like that, or do we envision something that's more of a narrative document that takes a different structure?
Oh, I see what you mean. At this point, I've still seen the slides as the guide for that and not a narrative piece.
Okay.
If there are any recommendations across subcommittees that you want to discuss right now with the other co-chairs, feel free to bring those up as well.
So, Dr. Dempsey, I think it's important for you and Dr. Weddington to know about the vote that occurred in licensure today. Kim, you want to share that so I left early, but I want to make sure it wasn't modified.
Sure, let me grab my notes. So there were thoughts around the traditional EPP program as the route to license 3. And first there was a vote for omitting the Praxis Core as the admission requirement for the EPP. I know that has not been because this is output based and not input based for this draft model. But they wanted to make sure that that was a recommendation that was set throughout their subcommittee. And then they also talked about the EPP program route as a measure to enter license 3. And that was unanimous to make sure that that was part of that license 3 entryway. And then also, in addition to that, it was also added that the EPP program route would be with EdTPA as the assessment that demonstrated that mastery. And then,
So I think to the point, Kim, I was trying to let Dr. Dempsey know about, they have adopted completion of a traditional ed prep program as a measure of effectiveness for holding the license 3. And so I know that that's going to have some impact, because theoretically that should be about prep and entry, but they decided that that was going to be a measure. So I just want you to be aware of that, because it may have implications for how you craft the language for your prep and entry recommendations.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I mean, Hank, we're going to have a impromptu co-chairs meeting here for about 2 minutes. I think, Hank, the way we have been using EPP has become, and I think it's been good in our subcommittee, that what we call an EPP might be refined or revised, or, we think about it possibly differently, but that EPP, there is that connection to a university K-12 partnership preparation program. So remember the conversations that we had about EPP as we define it today might be something different moving forward, but there's always the EPP present.
Yeah, that's correct. And that all of the EPPs, regardless of the incarnation or how they're manifested in the world, would meet the same standards for being approved in the state as an EPP and held to the same standards of accountability once they are approved, right?
Yeah. Did that make sense, Tom?
Yes, and so, but I think it's important, and my assumption here, though you're raising an interesting point, is that what we're calling traditional probably needs to be spelled out very clearly. That is a university, an institution, a college or university that has the ability to grant at least a baccalaureate degree, and the preparation program is embedded in the pursuit of that degree. So that would, by definition, exclude non-IHE EPPs, because they are what we consider the alternative route. They're residency.
And I would ask for like amended language from licensure that said a state approved EPP as opposed to a traditional EPP.
But all of our university EPPs are state approved.
Right, but all of our EPPs aren't traditional. So if they took the traditional away and just put state approved EPP, then that would open it up for anybody that was approved, right?
Well, that's why I'm saying that the definition of what we mean by a traditional route, I'm interpreting that to mean that it would, by necessity, exclude any EPP that is not university affiliated, because they can't grant degrees.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
even your programs within a university, your residency programs within a university would not qualify for that, because those licensure only programs are not yielding a degree.
Well, except for grad, MAT and post-bac, you could have a person, for example, who's in license 1 or license 2, who moves to a different license by having a university and or university PSU partnership based experience where they are connected to a university, but it might not necessarily be X number of credit hours. It might be structured differently by the EPP. Micro credentials, as an example, is still university connected when you use the term traditional EPP. When I think beyond the bounds of traditional EPP, it's not necessarily all of the program is delivered through traditional 3 credit hour courses. It's easier to imagine at the graduate level that you would have post-baccalaureate experiences that might be structured through something other than 3 credit hour courses that are still EPP based.
So
Hank, did I represent that legitimately?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The connection's still there, but not necessarily in the traditional format in which it is currently accepted. Yeah, I think you got it.
Tom, what I heard you say is different from what I just heard Van say. Am I incorrect?
Well, I mean, all I'm saying is what I think I understand. It's up to these folks to make sure that it's written correctly. Because that's the way I was interpreting what I heard, but I could be mistaken. The MAT and the and other kind of degree granting preparation, that sounds, I mean, that sounds fine to me if that's what is being recommended.
Yeah, I would just Van and Hank, as your subcommittee works, the definition, how you define it, whether it's traditional, state supported, I'm not what state funded, whatever it is, whatever the language is, that there's a very clear, explicit definition, because I think there's some room for misinterpretation and confusion if that's not presented.
And then I would also love to add that I am somebody who got an MAT. So I had an undergrad in biology and they got an MAT. It included all of the education courses, all of the theory courses, and also a student teaching experience. And so if we have programs that are similar to that in either post-bac or MATs, I think those teachers who are trained through that are probably very similar to the way that teachers are trained coming through the undergrad education. At least in my experience with the teachers who I've worked with as pre-service teachers that were student teaching in my classroom, their training was very similar to the training that I received in an MAT program.
Yeah, Maureen, I would call those people in your case yourself license 3.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So, go ahead.
Tom, just to summarize one more point from the subcommittee's conversations. I think our subcommittee's position is license 3 should be EPP based. 1 and 2 can be EPP connected, but all that's going to require that EPPs have to be more agile about how people access their programs. One route of which could be the traditional structure of an EPP. But they can also access it through post-bac, through alternative programs, through MATs, through university-based residency models or university-affiliated residency models. But we got that what the university folks are going to have to do is start to think more agilely about what it means to be an EPP, how we deliver the knowledge base and the experiences that we do with our PSU partners.
So that raises a question for me so if an MAT or a post-bac So residency is a post-bac, right? So let's say that I enter the profession as a licensed 1 teacher, and I enroll in an EPP and do a residency, and I've got 3 years in that role, and I complete the residency program, the coursework. The way we have this set up is for those teachers who come in without that training, we've scaffolded the process so that they're supported in incremental steps towards meeting those skills and competencies that we've set up. In the case, in this scenario, if I came in as a licensed 1 teacher and completed my coursework for a residency license while still in the license 1 phase, would then I move to a license 3 by virtue of completing that coursework, but then none of the other requirements for moving through that process, I would be held to.
Hank, I think if that person does what Tom just described and they complete that EPP-based program, they are licensed 3.
Yeah, that's what I think as well. And I think, and Van, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is where license 2 maybe is the most abstract for me, because so many of our programs you can finish in 1 to 1.5 years, whether it's an MAT or a residency license program. Trying to decide when they've met enough for license 1 to move into license 2 during that process, I think is still kind of a sticking point right there. But if they did what you just said, Tom, then I would think they'd go straight to license 3. If they've completed all the coursework and completed all the EPP requirements, they would have to be.
And Tom, could you add a little bit of clarity to the license too? So when I kind of read it and I think about it, I think of it as a person who maybe doesn't have any formal education training, but something in their either career or life experience has given them some of the tools that they need to be an effective practitioner. So for example, I was an Intel officer, and as an Intel officer, I had to design like learning modules. I had to give briefings. I had to tailor my briefings that I would give sometimes to a general, sometimes to an airman. I had to learn classroom management with fighter pilots. And so I had some of the skills that I had gained through that job to be an effective practitioner in a classroom, but they weren't directly tied to education or education preparation program. Is that kind of what the license 2 is for somebody that isn't coming in completely green into teaching, whereas the license 1 would be someone who has the BA or the BS, but has nothing else kind of that's helped train them to be a teacher, versus the license 2 where they also have the BA or the BS, no formal education training, but they have other things from their life or career experience that kind of lends to them being an effective practitioner?
Yeah, I think the way it was designed. So, well, let's just think about the in-task standards. So like our goal is that every teacher that is working in a classroom kind of autonomously is meeting at least proficiency on all these in-task standards. So and that's our goal, is that every kid in every classroom has a teacher that has demonstrated proficiency on these standards that we know are associated with better student learning. But the problem with today's model is we just throw those people into the classroom setting with no real support, and they've got all this stuff that they have to learn, and it's not in any way scaffolded, and there's no logical progression to how they move in relation to their salary in terms of acquiring those skills. That's what license 2 is all about. So it presumes that somebody has entered this profession without those skills or competencies, and they are working in a very supported and scaffolded way towards meeting that proficiency. And all license 2 is doing is giving them a kind of attaboy as they move up that scale. and acquire those skills and competencies. That's the way we're thinking about this. But what I feel like what's happening here is, with the recognition that completion of an ed prep program is in fact a measure of effectiveness, that you've met, that you have exhibited proficiency on all those skills that we value, then it almost seems to me like the license 1 and license 2 become moot. Or not the license 1, but the license 2 becomes moot. Because anybody that comes in at a license 1, our expectation is they're going to affiliate with an EPP and take coursework to develop those skills. And so I don't see how there would be incremental, or I don't see what the advantage to that incremental approach is if the kind of, there's a binary decision that yes, you've done this coursework, or no, you haven't. That's what moves you to a license 3. Because I don't see in this environment where any of this kind of progressive advancement towards that goal is really going to be realistic. I mean, people are going to come in at a license 1, do their coursework, move to a license 3. So in that case, you know, I made the kind of overgeneralized statement today. Then why aren't we just bringing everybody in on a license 3 and go from there?
Yeah, I agree with you, Tom, and I think that would address some of the nebulous ambiguity that Hank was talking about earlier, because similar to Hank, I really wasn't understanding what is a license to. How do you quantify the license to? And then to Maureen's example, I didn't, it didn't make sense to me. But even with that example, to me, it seems like it's a binary option. Either you have it or you don't. And once you start putting in this third option in there that's more ambiguous, we complicate unnecessarily, I think, the model.
Well, to that point, I think the theory behind this was initially that what we care about are the demonstrations of skill and competence, that we're agnostic to how one acquires those. And I think these conversations about how the EPPs fit into this have seriously kind of turned that thinking upside down. If it doesn't make sense in the way that we're talking about it now, I will agree with that. Now, that doesn't mean that I agree that this is the right approach. But I want to recognize that in this move in the way we're talking about what completion of an EPP means, the license 1 and license 2 don't make a whole lot of sense to me anymore.
Tom, I think it depends. I think it's, preparation and entry's got more to flesh out, but I dropped a note in the chat. It in part is connected to basically what we have right now is a person can become a clinical resident and they are a totally autonomous teacher in a classroom. That just like somebody graduates from an EPP with a bachelor's degree, they're autonomous in a classroom. Somebody steps in as a clinical resident with no prior experience, they're an autonomous teacher in a classroom. The way our subcommittee is looking at this is that there is a progression of knowledge, skills, and abilities to be in the classroom based in the NTAS standards, and that will parallel degrees of autonomy. So how much autonomy can someone at license 2 and license 1 and license 2 be given in a classroom? And how do the advanced teacher roles support people who are license 1 and license 2 as they build that professional capacity to be moved from not autonomous to semi-autonomous to autonomous? In the conversations we've been having about EPPs, the simplest thing is if you do what we have historically called completion of an educator preparation program based at a university with its K-12 partners, you're license 3. What we're starting to sort of reframe is, number one, EPPs in that space can be more agile in how they give people to that access to that knowledge base that leads to license 3. But EPPs with districts, and I say also add community colleges, can also be supportive agents in the license 1 and license 2 experience. So it's sort of rethinking what EPP means vertically in that pathway column, but also horizontally. How are EPPs, universities as a resource working with K-12 schools and districts to support license 1 and license 2 and people's ability to ultimately become license 4? So I think we're actually saying close to the same thing.
Oh, okay. So can I ask a clarifying question on that? Are you saying that then the actual that the course offerings within, or whatever, I don't want to limit it to courses, the training that one receives in the EPP should be aligned to this progression? In other words, we're not going to have students just taking, you got 10 total courses you have to take, and I'm just using that for simplicity's sake. And you're going to take whatever 5 you want now and whatever 5 you want later. Is the actual program going to be scaffolded to say completion of these courses would qualify you to move to a license 2, and then completion of these courses could move you from a 2 to a 3? And so we would get some signal from the EPP that yes, this person has met the requirements to move to a license 2.
Yeah, the EPP coupled with the PSU.
Okay.
Partnership with the PSU, that's number one. Number two, the professional learning. So think about it as professional learning experiences that are being provided to support the license 1 teacher through that connection between the PSU and the in the higher ed, the EPP partner. What are the professional learning experiences? For example, traditional credit hour based courses, but micro credentials, professional learning communities, other ways to structure the access to the knowledge base. How's that being provided to people at license 1 and license 2? So it's completion of those components coupled with performance assessments, that you using the NTAS standards and the NTAS progressions, that you're showing movement over time in that continuum such that you move from license 1. We assume most people would go to license 2. Ultimately, they're completing the same or parallel expectations to what we currently say are EPPs. You got to meet that same standard that we traditionally have called EPPs, and what we call EPPs right now should be a resource to that process. Not necessarily the only one. That, back to the point that was made a second ago, it's not about everybody has to be licensed 3, you got to do EPPs as we know them. It's that there should always be a connection to EPPs, because we have established that as the most effective knowledge base in North Carolina to become a teacher. So I think, Hank, speaking for the subcommittee, I don't think subcommittees mean the traditional route should be the only way, but why would we not connect to that knowledge base if we know it's that effective?
I totally get it. And I think that is much more in line with this idea of license 1, license 2, license 3. That process that you articulated indicates to me that those licenses are still of value, because they will incentivize and encourage folks to meet those competencies and skills that we care about, and it rewards them for doing that in an authentic way. That's great. I just want to make sure that train of thought is not left, because here's my other question for this group is, do this idea of the completion of an EPP without any external, and that's the way it was presented in licensure today as a measure that qualifies you for a license 3. How confident are we that the legislature would agree to that? And I think that has to be a consideration in this. It can't just, I mean, regardless of whether we think it's the right thing or the wrong thing, do we think that the General Assembly, that will resonate with the General Assembly?
Can you say again what the thing is?
The completion of an EPP without any testing associated with that or any measure of effectiveness to determine that they have met those skills and standards. And I'm talking external measures, that the General Assembly would go for that as an acceptable indication that these folks would be at a license 3 level.
Hank, I think our subcommittee would say there has to be, at a minimum, there has to be a performance assessment.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's correct. But Tom, didn't I hear you say that EdTPA had to be part of that?
Mhm.
Licensure said.
I think Kim, that occurred after I left, so I want to confirm that with Kim. And specifically, what I heard in earlier conversations was that EdTPA would be part of that, but that would be locally scored. It's not submitted to a national scoring.
You mean for the license 3 qualification?
Correct.
Yes, that each EdTPA would be that performance or that assessment that would provide
they-
the mastery.
Did they indicate that the EdTPA would be scored locally or the way we currently do it, the national scoring?
I didn't hear anything about local scoring.
Okay. All
They
right.
just said EdTPA.
There was no discussion of it either way, Tom.
Okay. I know I'd heard that.
I believe everybody assumed it would just be the national scoring.
Okay.
I mean, I'll say, Tom, individually, that would make me nervous if it was only locally scored. And I think our subcommittee would robustly debate that. But Hank, I think the folks in our subcommittee, speaking on their behalf, would generally support the fact that EdTPA was nationally scored.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I think that was the one thing everybody wanted to keep in there, even if there were other possibilities for proving proficiencies for the other measures that we use right now. I didn't hear it. PPAT was also included in there
Oh, yes.
as an option, right?
Absolutely.
One quick question for you all as you're considering or talking about this. Have you looked at, performance in terms of race, ethnicity, those types of things, just to ensure we're looking at, if we're going to include that as the metric, if you will, that we're considering demographic performance on the national performance of these assessments?
Yeah, Anthony, our subcommittee has discussed creating that while EdTPA is used widely, it would not necessarily be the performance assessment tool that we would use. That it may be that we think the state needs to develop a performance assessment tool to address some of the kinds of things you're asking about. What we have been consistent on is there has to be evidence of progression informed by performance assessment. So Tom, to your earlier point, it isn't just EdTPA or whatever the performance assessment is at the end. There's got to be evidence of performance through the program. So going back to something you said a few minutes ago, it may very well be that within an EPP, a traditional EPP program, there are early performance assessments that might be parallel to what somebody is using in license 1, that we would expect early performance assessments for somebody in license 1 to be parallel to what we would see as a performance assessment for somebody who's in a university-based EPP program. And what we're trying to stay focused on is the expectation of performance. And that's what has to be consistent across the pathway. And that a person who may have multiple tools to use to get to that knowledge and skill base, micro credentials, whatever that might be, courses, they've still got to meet that same expectation on performance. And so that piece, Anthony, plus your piece, I think our folks have been pretty consistent in, we're not saying it has to be at TPA. We're saying it has to be an instrument that meets the needs that are important to the state, which would be the kinds of questions, include the kinds of questions you're asking.
Okay, that's very helpful, and I'm sorry that we're having this conversation without the licensure co-chairs present, because I certainly don't want to misrepresent anything that was presented today, and they may have totally different views of what they approved today than what I'm representing. But that goes to the heart of what we're trying to do. What you've expressed here, Dr. Dempsey and Dr. Weddington, is exactly what resonates with me for the purpose behind these license 1 and license 2, is that we have to recognize that for many of our teachers, this will be an incremental process towards achieving that desired outcome. And the model needs to incentivize and recognize that progression, as incremental as it may be.
Yeah, also just for the point of discussion, Anthony, back to the question that you just asked, that is certainly a problematic part of EdTPA or any kind of standardized tool like that. If we go the route of building the tool that we think works best for the state of North Carolina, I would recommend that tool also has to have core components that are standard across the state, but it also needs components that are localized. So whether they're interns in an EPP or they're license 1 or license 2, number one is, do you understand core components of pedagogy and educator practice thinking with something like NTASC and how that's framed? But if we do this really well, it should have localized performance expectations. So depending on, are you in a predominantly rural, historically agricultural district in eastern North Carolina as compared to you're in Guilford County, then there's a situated knowledge base that's critical to that professional practice and how to capture that with whatever the tools are. And to make sure that the tool is not negatively discriminatory, that it provides that evidence of practice that we need. But we're a long way from developing that tool.
Oh yeah. And I do want to circle back and thanks, Van, for kind of explaining the license 1, license 2. I get it conceptually, so that was very helpful. Where I am right now, though, is thinking in terms of implementation, and this is down the road. But how do we ensure that whatever that license 2 is, when we're looking at its connectivity to the EPP, that is being applied consistently across institutions, or maybe that's, I don't know, but if one institution says, hey, you've taken 5 out of 10 classes and that we stamp you with license 2, is that being applied consistently across EPPs, or is it some other approach that might be used? So just getting in the weeds a little bit much, I know, but just trying to think through that consistently piece.
Dr. Graham, I dropped in a resource from EdTPA on those demographic subgroups. They list the mean score and the standard deviations. They don't give any information about pass rates. But if you look down on that, you can see that the African American mean on that is about 2.5 points lower than the white. And I think 45 is the mean, which is, I think, around the cut score for most of them.
Mhm.
And for the mean for African American is 42.6. So I think there is an issue there.
Mhm.
There is an equity issue that may arise from, and that's exactly why we need the multiple, as
Mhm.
Dr. Dempsey said, we need the multiple ways for us to demonstrate that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
Anthony, that point, the last point that you made has come up explicitly in our subcommittee, that when we get to the point of we're determining what is the evidence
Mhm.
of success that we're talking about, that it can't be left to, it can't be left to individual locations, individual
Mhm.
EPPs or whatever it might be. They can't sort of determine their own definitions of success, and there's got to be, it gets back to the TPA question. We
Mhm.
can't leave assessment of performance just to local,
Right.
the TPA, why a
Right.
TPA exists.
Gotcha. Good. Good.
Another recommendation that was brought up during the prep and entry subcommittee for budget and compensation was an increase in salary, and I didn't know if Dr. Dempsey or Dr. Weddington wanted to discuss any of that with Dr. Graham and Dr. Fleming.
Hank? Basically our subcommittees look at the licensure levels, and then the meeting that we had last week all recommended that we increase the compensation levels from apprentice up to license 3. Hank, it started at 2,000 if I remember correctly, and it was
Yeah,
sort of,
and it started with apprentice, and I think some of our P12 folks brought up the fact that to make that even a competitive salary with other industries, to bring somebody into that particular level, it ought to be at I think another 2,000 up, which meant everything else had to be adjusted after that.
Right. It was 35,000 instead of 30,000 for the apprentice, and then going license 140,000, and then and that's where it had stopped. But that's where we were gonna help you out for the next meeting, and also to provide that to Dr. Graham and Dr. Fleming for their meeting.
Yeah, just to clarify the impetus of this, since we started these meetings, Dr. Graham and Dr. Fleming, the state has implemented a 2.5% salary increase for teachers this year and next. So we've got to we've got to pitch this. It shouldn't radically change the cost, but we probably need to redo that compensation tool to say, okay, let's figure in that 5% increase for everybody and then recalibrate this. Because if we're not, I mean, now we're going to be just keeping everybody the same pretty much.
Mhm.
Anthony, this is Hank. Can I ask, is your subcommittee still considering our student teachers to come in at the apprentice level? Is that worked into the budget at all?
Student teachers.
So they'd be serving in the classroom.
I think I thought we were considering them at the apprentice level. Is
And
that
Was it the apprentice level?
That was my understanding.
yeah?
Okay.
yeah, I think I read in a set of minutes that if you're an intern in a license 3 EPP, that they would receive a stipend of $12,000 to $15,000. That's ringing a bell for some reason.
Yeah, I remembered seeing that. I was just, I guess I was wondering if that was an across the board, if there had been any decisions about whether or not every person who was in a student teaching or an internship placement would receive that, or if it's a select few, and if it goes up to 35,000 for apprentice, does that mean 17.5 for that one semester that they're in the classroom? I think those things would make a difference to the EPPs to know what kind of incentives might be out there for recruiting into EPP programs.
That's a good question, Hank. We'll circle back and make certain that we zero in on that to ensure that we've addressed it explicitly. I think we have. I'm just a little foggy right now.
Thanks.
And another thought from prep and entry was around increasing the professional advancement account amount. There was not a specific amount that was mentioned, but that was mentioned several times during the meeting. Just to let you know, Dr. Graham and Fleming.
Yeah, and I've also received some questions around, you know, the intent of that professional account is to get the individuals to that license 4, but there have been some people who've asked questions, why don't we continue that professional account for those individuals who are in license 4 and you know, support them with their growth, so maybe they become advanced teachers and all that stuff. So, you know, getting those types of inquiries and comments as well.
I agree.
Any other thoughts or questions, concerns, discussion items that you wanted to bring up amongst co-chairs?
Kim, when I logged in, I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Chair
Sure.
Miller wanted us to, in July, wrap up what we're doing. Is that what I heard, or did I
Yes.
miss?
So he wanted to make sure that we are making our decisions for July. And then have one last co-chair joint meeting like we are having now in August. And I'll send out a doodle poll for that.
Okay.
To try
Thank
to
you.
match schedules. Any other support that you need from DPI? Well, I know that we'll have our follow-up meetings or planning meetings per co-chairs, per subcommittee for the those co-chairs within the next week or two. So you can bring up anything then. Please feel free to email me between now and then. And I look forward to supporting you. Any last
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
you
you.
all.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Take care, you all.